appreciate the opportunity to address issues that are significant to the cattle industry, and particularly issues surrounding the pricing, price discovery, prices that the producers are receiving right now, both on the cattle side and the beef side. And so with us today to discuss these matters is Dr. David Anderson, ag economist with Texas A&M University. And so I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Anderson for his perspective on these various challenges facing the cattle industry. Dr. Anderson.
Well, thank you very much. I sure appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all today. And thanks again. This is a lot of these issues I certainly enjoy. You know, I enjoy working on these topics. I think they're pretty darn interesting, but also critically important for where we go as an industry and where we go forward. And there's a whole lot of things to consider. And I know that many of you will be watching this taped. And so, you know, certainly if you have questions, please get them to Travis. If there's some you want to direct to me, that's fantastic. He can certainly get them to me, and I certainly welcome any of those as we go along. I'm going to hit about two things in the few minutes we have together. I want to point out a few market adjustments and then jump into all of these issues in markets that we're talking about. And what I would say is that it's really coronavirus and the effects of coronavirus throughout our economy, throughout society, that's really ramped up some of the issues that are out there, because we see that with volatile prices, with falling prices to us as producers. And I think it just brings a lot of these issues to the forefront that we've been concerned about for a while, but this has ramped up the heat, if you will. I want to hit just a couple of things. You know, when I talk about really coronavirus, the effects of that through our economy, if we think about cattle slaughter, what adjustments are we seeing in the marketplace? You certainly see this blue line representing weekly cattle slaughter in the U.S. You know, we moved a lot of cattle early in the year clear through March, and then the effects of plant shutdowns and slowdowns hit us in April. And it's pretty easy to, sometimes I'm a picture-based person, and I look at a chart and it's pretty easy to see the decline. It's also easy to see the recovery in those numbers, how we have learned to process more animals. One is plants being open, but even though they're still running slower, how do we learn to adjust? And we've gotten cattle slaughter in the last couple of weeks back up, actually above where we were a year ago. So, these adjustments are happening. And one of the things I would leave us with too is that in terms of the market, the adjustments we're seeing happening, they are rippling all the way back through to cattle producers to the ranch, and they're going to go back the other way. And I think these adjustments, these rippling effects of coronavirus are going to be with us well into next year as well. But if we take a look at this and think about cattle slaughter, we know there's a backlog of animals. We know we've got more, bigger, heavier animals in feedlots to come to market. The cattle that we're slaughtering are heavier. And if we take a look at beef production now for about the last 5 weeks, because of heavier weights, as our slaughter is increased, we're producing more beef than we were a year ago. And so as we think about effects on prices, on cattle prices, more beef production than a year ago tends to lead us towards lower prices. There's more product there. And so we're past the July holiday as well. And we think about summer grilling seasons and holiday sales. It's a long 2 months from 4th of July to Labor Day. And summer, I don't know, if your temperatures have been like ours, summer got here. And so we've got this long summer to go. And this is another round of adjustments that we're dealing with. And as we look at fed cattle prices, certainly well below a year ago, and where we are now in the mid 90s for fed cattle prices, about $15 lower than we were a year ago. We've got this response of really, I think, two things. One, beef production's bigger than it was a year ago, but also, if we think about how and where folks eat beef, They're getting it from the grocery stores, or they're getting it from restaurants. And we don't have our restaurants back yet. Even if we were back to 50%, that's 50% versus the 100% we were at before this hit us. And so we've lost, I think, a significant share of our demand simply because we've lost those outlets for beef. And so, I think, as we kind of fundamentally, as we think about why prices are low, we got a couple of pretty strong fundamental things working against us. One is more beef production than a year ago, lots of cattle backed up in feedlots, but also some demand stuff. And so I think that really, gets us to the adjustments that we're facing. But these lower prices really focus, on some of these market issues. So let me jump into some of these issues. And when I come at these things, I'm going to come at these as an economist. And so that's sometimes different than how we might come up about how we think about the way things ought to work. I'm going to talk more like an economist. And I want to hit a few things: fed cattle markets, how fed cattle are sold, because that's really the nub of the issue, whether we're talking about formula versus negotiated cash. These are really all in those fed cattle markets as opposed to calf sales. I'll mention mandatory price reporting, some market power stuff. There's a bunch of others that we could go into, and I'll hit a couple of those, and a couple of them I'll ignore. But I also wanted us to, I'll make a couple of comments as an economist on these, but I know you've got some other speakers coming up who are going to be in depth with the Washington view of what's happening in some of these, on some of these issues that are going on. So let's talk fed cattle markets. 5014 and other proposals. Before 5014, there was a 3014 proposal. It really just means that it's going to require 50% of fed cattle to be sold in a negotiated cash format for delivery within 14 days. So that's where the 5014 comes from. It's really sort of a requirement that some percent of cattle be sold that way. And it really, as we dig down a little further, it gets to this idea that because we've had declining numbers of cattle sold in the cash market, that we've lost price discovery, that we've lost and what we really mean by that is how do we get to prices? How do we get buyers and sellers together, and how do they settle on the price that steer or heifer is going to move at? And that's really this discovery process. And so, as with that, as all of these are, whether this proposal or the others, none of them are, new ideas. These have been evolving over time. And let me show you a picture. What I have here is the total cattle sold by transaction type. And this is monthly data, and it goes back to 2011. If we look here on our chart, the red line are formula prices, the blue line are negotiated cash prices, the green line are forward contracts, and the black line with the dashes are grid pricing. And if you take a look at just take a step back and think about the trends, what we've had happening is more and more formula price cattle at the expense of negotiated cash cattle, where negotiated cash arrangements are declining. But formulas are going up. Now, this is total cattle for the U.S. If we really broke out and looked at regionally within where cattle are fed, which is really the plain states and into part of the Corn Belt, if we think about Southern Plains, Texas, Oklahoma, you got Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and Minnesota. If we broke out this data, what we would see is that as a national average, we're down around 20-25% negotiated cash, lately up around 65% formula. But if we looked at the Southern Plains, primarily Texas, 5 to 10% negotiated cash, some weeks zero cash sales, and over 90% sold by formula price. And that's really evolved over time. It didn't just up and happen all at once, but that's where we are today. If we looked at Northern Plains, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, places like that, a lot more negotiated cattle. And a question I get a lot is, why is it so different between those places? And I think, the first thing, if we think about Southern Plains, the structure of agriculture is different in the Southern Plains versus up there. We have a lot more, fewer, larger feedlots. We have, like everywhere, few very large packers. And that combination of a few large feedlots, relatively few large feedlots, and a few packers, I think we've moved that way simply because it is more efficient to sell them by formulas than working the phones every day, all week, every week, trying to make the sale. I think there's several advantages as formulas have developed. One is we don't spend that time and effort and people dedicated to calling around all the time trying to make a sale. The folks at the feedlot work on doing the best at what they do best, and that's feeding cattle efficiently, feeding them at the lowest cost that they can, boosting the productivity of the operation of the feedlot rather than spending their time trying to sell them. I think it helps with scheduling. I'm bringing in a lot of cattle. I got a big feedlot. I'm bringing them in. I need to know that I got a place to go and that those cattle are going to move. By the same token, if I'm a packer and I'm slaughtering 5,000 head a day, that's a heck of a lot of cattle. And I got to know I got those cattle scheduled to show up. And so I think one of the things that's happened is we've evolved to the point that we have reduced some of those, what we would call transactions costs, the costs of doing business, the cost of making those sales. We've squeezed some of those costs out of the system. And I think that's created more formula sales that in many ways have been good for both sides of the transaction. But when we get down to the point that no cattle trade in negotiated cash or very few, we certainly run into a problem of how do we establish or discover those prices? Because so many of the formula prices depend on a negotiated cash sale the week before. What I would argue is we have probably gotten to the point where we don't have enough negotiated cash sales. Now, if we look at the difference up in the Northern Plains, there's a lot more negotiated cash sales. We have a lot more smaller, what we call farmer feeders. We've got a lot more of those. Those are more negotiated cash sales. We also have a lot more cattle grade choice and prime. And it becomes, that's also involved in this in terms of there's some value to you to negotiate that price because I've got some cattle characteristics that I think are worth more and I benefit from selling those suckers dressed or in a carcass basis, but also in a negotiated format. And so those two tracks diverging from each other between Northern Plains and Southern Plains have really just plain evolved over time. It didn't happen overnight. What you'll see on that chart in the last couple of months, really during coronavirus, is we've had a significant drop in the number of cattle sold by formula price, but those have been captured in grid prices instead. And so we see some change happening going on throughout this as well. So, I think that picture is kind of worth showing that trend in what's happening. Let me see if I hit all my points. As we go through this, certainly we're concerned about price discovery. I think there's a couple of things to think about in 5014 or anything like that. We tend to not prescribe to folks how they have to do their business, how they have to sell. So in a way, this is a little different kind of philosophical type of argument, and we may come out on a lot of different sides there. But the goal is to get more price discovery as we think of a price discovery effect by trying to get more negotiated cash prices. I think a key question is, if, as an economist, if if moving to more formula prices has reduced costs in the system, going back to a different way, negotiated cash prices that we used to do a lot more of, by my argument, results in higher costs. So the idea is if we had, certainly if we had more, the idea is if we had more negotiated cash trade, by gosh, we'd get more competition for those cattle, and surely we'd have higher cattle prices. What I'd suggest to you to think about is that may not necessarily be the case, because by going back to forcing more negotiated prices, we force more costs in the system. We force more costs of doing business or costs of making the trade, making the transaction. And if we do that, those costs don't just disappear. I think the likely result is that we would see is we'd probably see lower fed cattle prices because of it, simply because we force more costs. And so getting more price discovery is a good thing. Getting more prices reported is a good thing, where we know what that market is. Trying to make sure that we have a competitive market is a good thing, but it may not result in higher prices. And I think that's sort of a common sense kind of thing to think about going forward. A little bit on price reporting. I know you're going to have some more in-depth talk from Washington about mandatory price reporting. It's supposed to be reauthorized in September. And I'd just say, time is growing short, but as my view as an economist is, I think if we want a functioning competitive market for cattle, then we got to have mandatory price reporting. Confidentiality is certainly one of those issues in mandatory price reporting. My view as an economist, I tend to think that, if there's a trade that happens, it ought to be reported to get to a functioning competitive market and support that competitive market that's going on. So I think that's a really important issue going forward. Certainly the market power packer investigation is ongoing. USDA has a study going on that they have one that started after the packing plant fire last fall, I think in Holcomb, Kansas, back in August. They're trying to jump in and do another study on price movements since coronavirus. And the Department of Justice has gotten involved. They've certainly sent out subpoenas. I hope I spelled that right. I had to get online and figure out how to spell it. but they've certainly sent out subpoenas gathering records and data, and they're moving forward to explore this idea of market power. So again, as an economist, some things a couple points I would make is, if you told me we're going to close a bunch of packing plants, what should happen to fed cattle prices and beef prices? If I lose a plant, I've lost some demand for fed cattle. That plant is not buying cattle, which really should tell me that prices go down in the live market. Also, that plant's not producing any beef. And so beef prices ought to go up. What does that mean then? Lower live cattle prices, higher beef prices, a wider margin, if you will, as we might calculate it. But those direction of price movements that I would say as an economist, in theory, is exactly what has happened in the marketplace. Now, where we're going to fight is, what's the magnitude of those changes? That's where I think there's a whole bunch of research and investigation really needed. Does the magnitude of price changes reflect a reasonable amount of price change based on what we've seen in these other events, plants closing or slowing down? Or does it reflect some market power? Because it's certainly the case that our big four packers control something like 85% of fed steer and heifer slaughter. And anytime we have that kind of concentration, we ought to be thinking about market power and monopoly power in the marketplace, which is really, I remind my students all the time, or I try to anyway, monopoly is one of these things that is a failure of a competitive market. We talk about a lot of things that are market failures. Well, monopolies is one of them. And there are bad effects from monopolies on both consumers and producers of those inputs going in there. So we've got this investigation going on. As an economist, that's the way I think about it, and I'd hope that might help focus some thinking too this summer. a couple of questions about retail prices. I just wanted I got several of these this week because retail beef prices came out on July 14th. I wanted to point out a couple of things here. One is if I just took a look at retail beef prices as reported, gathered by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and shown by USDA, or reported by USDA, we've certainly seen retail beef prices go up. And for the month of June, they declined just a touch for choice, but still pushing $7.60 a pound across all beef cuts. Yet we know fed cattle prices and calf prices have declined. They've gone back down. Wholesale prices have gone down. Why don't we see that change here? I would suggest to you a whole bunch of that is just plain in the timing of prices. This data is gathered in the second week of June from grocery stores only. If you think about grocery stores buying product a couple of weeks or so before that to stock on the shelves, that gets us back in a time period where we still had very high retail prices. And so I think we just haven't seen enough time pass to capture this adjustment in retail prices. But it's always a concern for us when we think about, man, we know what's happened to live cattle, to our calf prices and fed cattle prices. They've come back down. They're below a year ago. Yet why aren't retail prices responding to those lower prices? And I think in this case, some of it is just plain a timing issue with the data. I might suggest something else. We always know prices go up faster than they go down, and we see that at the gas pump. That's the example I always use. In this case, I think we'll see a little time go, some time will help this. The other thing you might think about as you walk through your grocery stores, take a look at hamburger prices. Hamburger is one of those things that it's such a versatile product for everybody. And as we think about being in a recession, folks buy ground beef in a recession, and because it's certainly more versatile, it's more it's more price friendly, and the other thing is we're all, without that restaurant trade nearly as big, we're all going to grocery stores. And I think we'll see a lot of grocery stores don't necessarily have to run features on beef to get you in there to buy the product, or at least on ground beef anyway, because we're already going in there and buying it anyway. And so they may not have to run as many specials to get us in the door. And so I thought that was worth a point. Summary, there's a lot more issues going on that we're concerned about than I've touched on here. Certainly futures markets and their functioning. And do they function for us as producers or on the producer side of the industry? Country of origin labeling is another one. I think if I was going to think about this in the big picture, I think we got to take some time to think real carefully about what are the real fundamental issues we're working on and concerned about, and what are the ones that are the impact of coronavirus that have caused market volatility that we might not have seen otherwise. I think we just want to make sure we take care not to change the wrong thing, that we're seeing a signal that's a temporary market signals and adjustments, at least I hope they're temporary, that are the effect of coronavirus throughout our system, but those may be temporary compared to some of the real issues. I do think, looking into market power, looking into monopoly power and its effect not only on producers but on consumers is an important one. And I think that's a real issue. And that was already with us before coronavirus hit and caused all these market gyrations. So, I certainly think, I bring myself back to thinking about constantly what are real issues in the market, underlying fundamental issues versus the impact of what's going on from coronavirus. And I would also point out, I think these adjustments that coronavirus has kicked off are going to be with us for a long time. And I think they're just going to ripple back and forth through our system. And those things are going to be around for a while. And with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be with y'all. And I wish you good luck on your, I wouldn't call this virtual online summer conference, but I hope things go well. And certainly I'm open anytime to any kinds of questions or follow up on any of this stuff. And with that, thank you very much for having me on.
Well, thank you, Dr. Anderson. We appreciate you joining us for this session, and you certainly hit the gamut of challenges and issues that industry is facing, and we certainly. I want to follow up, if I can, with one of just to reiterate on your price discovery discussion here, and I think you made the point of differences between regions on how much cattle are traded by cash versus formula, and particularly in the Southern Plains, which is basically the market that sets our calf prices in this state. The trading down with less than 10% cash trade, and the real reason you mentioned it's just that has evolved over time, but one of the real reason why it's more prevalent, formulas are more prevalent in the South than they are the North. Can you kind of reiterate your thinking on why that difference occurs? Is it the type of cattle, or is it the structure of the industry? And I guess it's both.
I think that, I think you bring up a good point. I don't think I mentioned the type of cattle in this as well, but I do think it's kind of the structure of the industry. Large feedlots, large packers, and moving large numbers of cattle throughout the year. And I think that is a big difference, Southern Plains versus North. We have feeders in the North that, feed lots of cattle and year-round feeders, but we also have farmer feeders, what we always called farmer feeders, but folks that have a feedlot and feed some cattle, but they may only feed one turn a year through the winter, perhaps. So we've got a different kind of structure of that market where, types of cattle are important too. You think about our Texas feedlots, where do the cattle come from that go into those Texas feedlots? Well, a whole bunch of them come from Texas, but a whole bunch of them come from the South. And we have, our environment's hot and humid. We have a lot more Brahma cattle or influenced cattle in that. We feed those cattle further south rather than in Iowa or Minnesota, kind of for obvious reasons. But we draw cattle from throughout the South and the Southwest into Texas feedlots. I think another difference I didn't mention is we also tend to sell more cattle in the Southern Plains live rather than dressed. We sell more cattle live down here. If you had a lot of cattle that you were convinced were going to grade prime, high choice, you wanted to try to participate in some of the grids that are out there that reward, or a formula that rewards quality, and you're going to have those. That's another thing in the Northern Plains that I think tends to support that negotiated price, is because we're negotiating on some type of quality that we expect to be delivered. I think I'm going to deliver something that has a higher quality. I mean, it's no secret that, you compare Texas to Nebraska or other places up north, we have a lot more cattle grade select and choice. They have a lot more cattle grade prime. And so I think that's where the type of cattle, the quality grade that's showing up also is related to how we sell them. How do we get those prices? And that's whether it's live versus dressed, but also gets into that structure of formulas versus negotiated cash. I hope that got somewhere close to you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess some of the discussions in the industry, everybody's appear to be hanging their hat on the way to fix price discovery is to require a certain amount of cash trade. Yeah. You say the more cash trade is there, you do a better job of price discovery, but that may or may not lead to better prices, but you discovered whatever the price is there.
Yeah, I think that's.
So I guess my follow-up question is, and it's probably a $64,000 question. What percentage of the cattle trade needs to be cashed before you have an adequate level of price discovery?
That is a good one.
Yeah,
So,
I know answer my question that you don't know that percentage, but the proposal is to dictate a certain percentage. What percentage is needed?
so there's some interesting research by one of my colleagues, Dr. Steve Kuntz at Colorado State University, and he's done some research to try to come up with that number. And so he's done some work, and he's kind of broken it out by state. And I should have stolen one of his slides and used it for this.
Yeah.
But he's actually done trying to come up with some estimates of how many you got to trade in cash. And seems like in Texas, you needed something like in a range of like 6,000 to 13,000 head in these periods of time would be enough to get you more price discovery. As you go to other regions of the country, it's a larger number in some of those other regions. And so it really differs by some regions. Colorado is an interesting case because we haven't had prices reported in Colorado for quite a while. And it's because of confidentiality rules. They can't be reported because we don't have enough trade by enough buyers to actually even report prices. So we'd have to see some changes there in terms of how many are sold in negotiated cash trade, but we also need another buyer sometimes to get those prices reported. So
either that or change the confidentiality rules that allows reporting when you have fewer than 3 buyers.
Yep, that's right. And, in confidentiality, I think that's interesting. We want to protect people's confidentiality. That's in the legislation. How USDA goes about it is their own regulatory decision, how to implement what's going on. And I think, over time, changing markets, it may be time, might be time to look at how you do that. What do we really need to have to maintain confidentiality? And quite honestly, is confidentiality all that important? Because sometimes you get to an industry that's small enough, everybody knows what's going on. You got to wonder, is there any real secret out there?
Sure. Let me add one. Yeah.
Can I follow up on one thing? I want to say, you made the comment about price discovery, and I guess I might put it this way, that, we can get more price discovery by mandating some of these, how we sell. But getting more price discovery comes with a cost, and we might get more price discovery, but we might not get better prices out of it. And I think that thinking about, what's the trade-off? More discovery, but also more cost to get it. And I think that's to me, that's a good thing to think about as we go forward, is what's it worth to get this? And are there other ways to maybe get the same thing?
Right. Let me throw another issue somewhat related here in this whole mix of discussion that's floating around the industry now. And that has, some people have questioned the role of imports and exports and its impact on the industry. Any comments on those items?
Boy. That's another hot button one.
Well, that's another seminar in itself, I'm sure. But
it is.
Any top line comments on the import export situation?
So I get asked. I've been asked forever, as long as I've been doing this. Why on earth do we export and import at the same time? And the key is, we always talk about it being beef, but if we're looking at a carcass, not all beef's the same. There's different cuts. They have different values. There are cuts of beef that we don't eat a lot of in the U.S., but there's other places in the world that like them. And so we find a market out there that somebody's willing to pay more than we are for it. And I'll tell you, I've sort of laughed about this forever, but liver is one of those. We export about 70% of our livers. If we were relying on me to eat those livers, we'd be waiting a long time. I had an old colleague. He would, he once a week he made his pilgrimage to Luby's for liver and onions, and I chose not to partake. But I think we do trade both. We import. Most of our imports are trimmings lean trimmings from places like Australia and New Zealand that we turn into ground beef because we don't have enough old cull cows to make all the hamburger we want to eat as consumers. And so we import. We export stuff. We export high value stuff because we eat a lot of hamburgers. We eat a lot of steaks too, but we have more steaks than consumers are, willing to eat at the price. And what we have is some consumers in other countries who are willing to pay us more for them. So we export them. So it's how a market works. And I think we're fortunate we're really fortunate to have a vibrant trade, both import and export, to help us meet the supplies that we want as consumers. If we look to here in coronavirus, our exports dropped dramatically in May. A combination of reduced slaughter, reduced beef production, record high wholesale beef prices, and a stronger dollar really made us uncompetitive in some export markets. And our exports really dropped off to show it. And so one of the other things that those high prices do is they encourage us to import some more. Imports actually were below a year ago a little bit, but did not decline like other things. I think we could spend a whole seminar digging into trade and why and who we trade with. But really, in a nutshell, in a market economy like we have, when we export, we're finding customers somewhere else that are willing to pay more for the item than we are, which means us as producers get more for that product we're producing ultimately. And on the import side, we import stuff that we want more of ourselves, and we get a good price for it from somewhere else. And so trade, in our case, we both export and import. There are countries that are pretty much all importers because they got a lot more beef than they got folks, like Australia, for instance. And so they're much more export based, and we have some of both. I will leave you with one comment. I got to tell you, long term, I'm an optimist on this industry. I think we got a lot of challenges and we got lots of issues and stuff we're worried about how the market functions, but we're starting from an underlying base of our consumers like our product. We could use a growing economy, but longer term, I'm pretty optimistic on the cattle industry, beef markets. And so I'll just leave you with that.
Well, we could spend all day in discussions on these. I sure appreciate your participating with our session here today.